Thank you so much for the invitation and for staying back to chair Professor Upendra and Akbar and the Department of Political Science. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I didn't expect it. I was quite taken aback. This is my first time in Aligarh, and I already know three people here very closely. As Professor Upendra had just mentioned, justice has a long and varied history, a very complicated one, but there's one moment which, irrespective of our differences on how we approach the concept, we can all come to basic agreement. And that's, as the professor had mentioned, the appearance of the word justice in the preamble of the Constitution. So I think I'll start with this point, because when we come to see the preamble, although it's very short, I'm going to read you the original version prior to the 42nd Amendment. We'll see that the concept is given of a very pronounced specificity. So irrespective of where we come from, we can all identify this document and then use that document to go branch off into different directions. So let's look at the preamble of the Constitution. This is the November 1949 version. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. So I'll just leave off there. So there are a number of rich concepts for anybody from political science. We already see signaled in the preamble 5 or 6 of the most crucial concepts to the entire study of political science. And it's fascinating. So if we were to take up how they come in order: sovereign, democratic, republic, and then justice, social, economic, political, then liberty, equality, fraternity, and fraternity divided up into dignity of the individual and unity of the nation. So sovereignty, democracy, republic, justice, social justice, economic justice, political justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation. These are the concepts that are packed into just what took me about 12, 13 seconds to read, the preamble of the Constitution. Now consider that each of these concepts, as Professor Upendra had mentioned, are similar to justice in the sense that they are all highly contested. And yet they have specific legacies, what we refer to as a provenance. A provenance is the genealogical background that informs you of where this concept came from. So in other words, we can talk about justice in Plato, for example. But what does that have to do with the 1949 preamble? Very, very little. So the question becomes, what are the backgrounds of all of the various traditions and all of the competing traditions? What are the backgrounds that actually crystallize into November 1949? Because large masses of the history of ideas, the history of philosophy, the history of political philosophy, the history of social philosophy, large masses of all of that is summarily excluded. And only some traces go in to make concrete what we have as our preamble. So it's important to then reflect, on the one hand, where did our preamble come from? What are the ideas that went into it? And then as a further stage, which of course we won't cover today, but this is what you as political science, students of political science, political theory, political philosophy, sociology, history, what you need to reflect upon is, why these and not others? Where are the others? Why did we not include the others? Does the Constitution incorporate the possibility of subsequent inclusion of the others? Why is this important? Because, as you'll see, a lot of what is excluded in the construction of the preamble are things that are extremely dear to all of us. Will we be able to recuperate them into our sense of justice, or are they forever to be excluded in the Indian nation. So, the first concept, sovereign. What does it mean to be sovereign? This is specific legacy. It's obviously a reaction to imperialism. So we declare ourselves sovereign, autonomous amongst a body of other sovereign nations. What's the history of the idea of that? It's very precise. It goes back to Hobbes. We can postpone this, but I mention Hobbes because there's a very different conception of sovereignty. So I had read the preamble, we the people. There's a very different conception of sovereignty. So if you look at constitutions of Islamic states, in fact, all the 40, I think there were 40, last time I checked, there were 40 in the Organization of Islamic Council. Every one of them attributes sovereignty not to the people, but to Allah. So you have, right from the very beginning about the preamble of our constitution, a choice made about the sources and origins of sovereignty. And it is a choice that is heavily debatable. Democratic, there were a number of other organizations that were possible, considering how feudal India had been for millennia. To choose one person, one vote in 1949 was not only radical for India, it was globally radical. Universal suffrage, male and female. There were not many countries, when this was proposed in India, there were not many countries around the world, including the West, that had included this. And then a republic, in other words, not a direct democracy, but elected through officials. These are each choices that are being made, choices that would control the rest of our lives, and not in some abstract way that, as I hope to show you today, that have specific impact even on something like the elections that we're about to go through in the next month. So then we move to justice. Justice as social, justice as economic, justice as political. This does not appear in any other constitution that I know of. I'm a comparative constitutional lawyer by training, so I've read dozens of constitutions. As far as I know, this trifold conception of justice is unique to the Indian Constitution, to the preamble. Thank you. And what I want to highlight for you is that this uniqueness is not an accident, it's a necessity. It's a necessity because as much as the Constitution excludes in its preamble and its directive principles, and then in the text itself, its aim was not exclusion, its aim was inclusion. The aim of the Constituent Assembly, as articulated by Nehru in the Objectives Resolution, was to include as many divergent voices because India is a deeply plural society. So from the social justice point of view, we bring in the underlying conceptions of caste inequality, very dear to the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. Ambedkar. So in the social justice, we import all of Ambedkar's fundamental concerns about how justice has been lacking for 2 millennia in India. From the economic justice point of view, we bring in ideas from Marx that were very, very powerful in the 1930s, 1940s, in the drafting of the Constitution. As I'll talk about some choices in the wording of the preamble, changes were made between 1947 and 1948 to accommodate how important the conception of class, the Marxist legacy, was, so much so that economic justice was incorporated as fundamental in the preamble. And then political justice. Political justice is in some ways the easiest because this is the conception that appears in all constitutions. This is the classic liberal conception that goes from Hobbes, as I had mentioned, all the way up to Kant, Hegel, Marx, and the framers of our Constitution. These then get reflected, liberty, equality, fraternity. The liberty idea is, of course, that very political conception of justice, political justice, civic rights, civil liberties. And then the equality idea, once again, reiterates the social justice aspect that's mentioned under the trifold division of justice. And then in the fraternity, things get very complicated because fraternity is a concept, as you students of political science know, There are 1,000 books written about liberty, 1,000 books written about equality. How many books have you ever seen written about fraternity? Fraternity is a concept, though championed during the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, that more or less dropped out of sight in the history of political thinking since the French Revolution. And yet, and it was incidentally Dr. Ambedkar, if you're interested, it was introduced into the preamble despite resistance, not wanting it to be there. So, as a means of ensuring that fraternity could function within the preamble of the Constitution, some adjustments were made. These adjustments occurred in articulating fraternity within the concept of dignity of the individual and unity of the nation. So you get this dialectic then between the individual and the nation. And this dialectic between the individual and the nation, as I had mentioned, continues to play out today. So we'll talk about the way that the concept of justice emerged in the the modern period where the articulators of the ideas that went into the Constitution, how these have continued to travel up until the year 2019. Now, I read you the November 1949 version of the preamble. What I would like you to see now is the October 1947 version of the preamble. So just a few months before the preamble that we have today, at least up until the 42nd Amendment, I think, as you probably know, the 42nd Amendment simply introduced the idea of secular, of socialist, and then in that unity of the nation part that I had read, dignity of the individual, it added integrity of the nation. Unfortunately, I think, but that's another question. The 1947 Draft Constitution. Here's the preamble. What could have been the Preamble of India? We, the people of India, so we keep the same sense of sovereignty, seeking to promote the common good. What does that mean? Common good doesn't appear in our preamble. So did it disappear? Did we decide not to seek the common good? Or is it rather that ideas like justice, social justice, economic justice, political justice, is what captured and represented more precisely what the common good is in India? We, the people of India, seeking to promote the common good, do hereby, through our chosen representatives, enact, adopt, and give to ourselves this Constitution. I don't know how you feel. I find that very boring. So it's wonderful that the change had been made from the draft in 1947 up to the 1949 version that was handed over to the President of the Constituent Assembly for signing. The question is, how did that change occur? Why is it that the concept of justice took over? If you will assent, at least for the time being, to my argument or suggestion that the idea of the common good in the original preamble took specific articulation as social, economic, political justice in the current preamble. How is it that we moved from this vague and somewhat lifeless preamble to the preamble that we have today, which, as I had mentioned, is unique in global constitutions for having such a precise articulation of the nature of justice? So those of you who study constitutional history within political science or history or are familiar with the process in the 1940s would know that the Constituent Assembly had created a drafting committee and appointed Ambedkar as the chairman of that drafting committee. That drafting committee was not to create a constitution out of nothing. It was, in fact, by B.N. Rao given a draft constitution to work with, and that preamble is the preamble of the draft constitution given by B.N. Rao. Then the drafting committee met for a total of 42 days, not consecutive days, but 42 meetings over about 60, 70 days. And in each of these meetings, we have the minutes, which are, believe me, not very lively minutes, but that record how it is that B.N. Rao's draft constitution turned into the constitution that we had in 1950. And one thing that I want to point out which I find very fascinating. There's very little literature on this topic, so I have to go into the original minutes of the minutes of the drafting committee. The first day that they met, they decided they were going to go in order. So start at the beginning of the draft constitution and discuss and debate and rewrite, revise, recreate each article from beginning to end. So what does that mean? That means on day one, what would they be discussing? The preamble. But something strange happened in our drafting committee. Dr. Ambedkar made a motion without any justification, stating, let's postpone the preamble to the very end and start with Article 1 of the Constitution. And everyone said, all right, we can do that. Why not? Makes some sense because the preamble is to tell you, give you a conception of what the meaning of the whole is. So if we don't know what the whole is, how are we going to articulate its spirit? So the committee met 39 days. On the 39th day, they were finished. All of the articles were done, drafted. And then it came back to the preamble. And it's very interesting. I encourage you, I was at your beautiful library here. I'm sure you have the texts. I encourage you to look at the Constitutional Drafting Committee meeting of the 39th day, because on that day, Dr. Ambedkar pulls out of his pocket on a sheet of paper his idea for what the Preamble of India's Constitution should be. It has nothing to do with the original that I had read to you, except we the people of India. Only that remains. And the rest is completely rewritten. How is it rewritten? It's rewritten to prioritize justice. So it's the preamble that I had read to you more or less completely. There are a few things, I won't get into the differences between what Ambedkar pulled out of his pocket and what we got finally 3 days later. So I had mentioned it was the 39th day when he mentioned it. Everybody was satisfied with it. There was a weekend, that was actually a Friday. And then the drafting committee people went home. They met again on Monday, and when they met on Monday, there were innumerable revisions suggested to the draft preamble. So the original draft preamble that Dr. Ambedkar had proposed had, under the concept of social justice, dignity of the individual irrespective of caste. So you can see that usage of the term caste, which contextualizes the nature of social justice and Ambedkar's concern about dignity. The relationship between justice and dignity is that this should be enjoyed by every individual irrespective of caste. But leftists were not too happy with this, and they asked, why caste and not class? So draft 2, day 40 of the drafting committee. Justice, social, economic, political, dignity of the individual, irrespective of caste and class. So this became, and then day 41, people from the right said, why do you prioritize the dignity of the individual? What about the duties to the nation that we have? So then Dr. Ambedkar, always pragmatic, said, all right, dignity of the individual, irrespective of caste and class, and the unity of the nation. Day 42, why does individual come first and nation come later? We should have the unity of the nation and the dignity of the individual irrespective. And then Dr. Ambedkar said, okay, this is going out of hand now, all of these small issues. Let's come to an agreement. We'll remove both caste and class, and we'll put the dignity of the individual prior to the unity of the nation, because, as Dr. Ambedkar famously argued, I suppose people are relatively familiar with, you can't have unity of your nation unless you have dignity of your individuals who compose that nation. Was that settled? Was that it? November 1949, the preamble comes, it's approved. Other than the 42nd Amendment, which added those three concepts, added to unity of the nation, the unity and integrity of the nation. Was it settled? Absolutely not. Because the notion of individual dignity and what constitutes that dignity in terms of a justice that is divided into social, economic, and political as the preconditions for the individual to enjoy dignity within a democratic republic, This has yet to be decisively determining our political fate. There's always a back and forth between unity and integrity of the nation versus the rights and privileges of the individual. And so you can see that in contemporary times with, for example, I think, did we first meet at JNU, Akbar, or at JNU? Or in Lucknow? Okay. So when I was a visiting professor at JNU, the preoccupation was, are we anti-national? Everybody has heard that, right? The anti-national idea. Well, what does it mean to be anti-national? It's not an abstraction. Once again, this concept comes back to the 1949 Preamble, the debates that were going on at that moment about shouldn't the nation come before the individual? And Ambedkar's demand that no, the dignity of the individual, which means justice, political justice, social justice, must be prior to the unity of the nation conceptually, because what nation are you unifying? You're unifying a nation of individuals. And when the activities on the JNU campus, for example, where I was teaching, when these activities attempt to demand certain alterations of the conception of individual dignity, social, political, and economic rights, the accusation does not unfold at the level of, let me challenge your conception of dignity and justice with my conception of dignity and justice. Rather, it unfolds as a clash of these two rival concepts. Your conception of justice versus the nation. So do you see what I'm trying to say? So the argument doesn't occur within the strictly conceptual realm of what do we mean by justice. The argument unfolds in terms of two antagonistic concepts, the difference between your concept of justice and the nation. Consequently, those who have a different conception of justice are not argued against as being rivals on an equal plane. They are rather being othered into a realm of the anti-national. They are disrupting the unity and integrity of the nation. And why I bring this up is not to be excessively political. I'm not an extremely political person. I'm bringing it up because I want you to realize that the concept of justice, which you might be taught of in political science as merely one concept among others, as merely an abstraction, is nothing of the sort. It is a very concrete, political, cogent, and real concept that is battled, wrestled, and struggled with every day, both at the individual level and at the level of the state. So this is, in some way, the nature of how justice arises, on the one hand, as a common focal point for each of us from very different perspectives to come and say, all right, we each have different ideas about justice. We each subscribe to different traditions and ideologies, religions that give us a particular articulation of justice, or philosophies that give us a particular articulation. That's fine. We're a plural country. But then we focus in on what, as you probably know in Rawlsian languages, something like an overlapping consensus, which you can find in our preamble. But that doesn't solve the problem, because from 1949 to 2019, we have a constant dialectic between the notion of justice as comprising social, economic, political, which is to say the dignity of the individual articulated through non-caste prejudice, ameliorating the issues about class, economic privilege, poverty, and the classical liberal political ideas of the right to vote, freedom of assembly, and all of these things. This cluster of ideas versus a nationalist conception, the unity and integrity of the nation, that cluster of ideas. So while we exclude all kinds of rivals and focus in on a particular conception of justice that fills an area that we can each at least understand, whether or not we agree with it ideologically, it solves a number of problems about our pluralism, but it creates a new problem about the significance of the individual in relation to the nation. And so now justice has to be considered in terms of this dialectic between the priority of individual human dignity, as articulated in the preamble, and the priority of the unity and integrity of the nation, as articulated in our preamble. So, to close this first part of the conversation, the idea of justice, as vast as it is, comes to some concretion in our preamble, but the preamble, instead of solving all the problems, solves many of them and opens up a new one. And the new one that it opens is one that is continuing to create antagonisms, even in 2019, articulated or exemplified, for example, in this random example of JNU as anti-national. So that's such a concept, accusing someone of being anti-national, which is very vague, right? What does justice mean? What does nation mean? We have to get to the heart of some of these. I can't claim to know the full nature of the nation and then say you are outside of it. So while these concepts are very nebulous, nevertheless, they are the things that continue to strain us in 2019. So what I want to talk about then, moving on, is how did we get those concepts? What is the content of justice, and what is the content of nation, and how is it that this antagonism that has remained for the last 70 years, how is it that this gets made fossilized, made permanent? As far as I can see, maybe you disagree, I don't see any change in this antagonism happening in the next 5 years, whichever government comes to power. I mean, do you think if we bring in a little more left government, suddenly we've solved the problem of who fits in the nation? Not at all, right? So this is going to be a continuously lingering problem for us. Let's see, where did it come from? Where did it arise? So in terms of the specificity of the 1949 articulation in the preamble, these concepts, sovereignty, liberty, does this preamble incorporate numerous rival traditions? It in fact incorporates very few. So we could think about, you can just do it as an experiment, being familiar with the text of the Constitution and being familiar with rival traditions, how much of the ideas or the application of these concepts were pulled out from the long history of Indic philosophy, religion, and practice. So, for example, let's say pre-Abrahamic India, all right, what we call Hindu or Buddhist or Jain or something like this. So how much of these ideas do you feel resonating in that preamble that I had mentioned? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Last time I read the Brahmanas or Upanishads, these were not concepts that were spread around. And if not in the Upanishads, then definitely not in the Brahmanas. And if definitely not in the Brahmanas, then certainly not in the Vedas, not in the Puranas. So in terms of pre-Abrahamic, so let's not include Islamic history, how much do you feel any resonance with Indic political philosophical conceptions with the preamble that I had read to you? It's next to nothing. I mean, I can't think of anything, but there must be something, but I see nothing there. But this is strange. All right, so maybe Ramayana hasn't been captured in our preamble, but what about the Dharma Shastras? We have innumerable, I don't know if you've read, or if you're familiar with Kane, has written this 5-volume history of the Dharma Shastras in India. What of the Dharma Shastras have concretized, crystallized into our preamble conception of justice? I see nothing. Not even the Manusmriti. So as you probably know, there's a long history of pre-Manusmriti Dharmashastras where caste is much more flexible, and there's not a clear-cut ranking of the varnas. So, prior to Manu, there was a constant battle for supremacy between Kshatriyas and Brahmins, a history that repeats all over the Aryan world, ancient Aryan world. So in Plato's writings, you can see when Plato talks about the republic, and we use that as a metaphor, that the city, the ideal city, will be divided into various castes, right, with different kind of blood running through people's veins, which will be supported through a police that takes people out who mix these castes, takes people out and murders them in the night and things like this. This all seems like a fantasy, but if you put it into Aryan history, from Ireland to Iran to Greece to northern India, you see that all of Aryan history has been struggling with a rivalry between priests and princes, Brahmins and Kshatriyas. And what's unique about India is, thanks largely to the revolution effected by Pushyamitra, the end of the Ashoka's dynasty, and the writing of the Manusmriti, you get a concrete representation of the four Varnas as a ranked hierarchy with the Brahmins, the priests on top. And all the subsequent Indian history gets molded to fit that paradigm. So Rig Veda, as you probably know, Mandalam 90, gets rewritten to give this primal depiction of the Brahmins coming from the head and so on, right? These are all subsequent rewriting to establish that specific system. Is any of this in our preamble? Is any of this in our sense of justice? So I'm telling you, I'm trying to drive this point home, that our preamble has got an exclusion, a precise and definite exclusion of almost every single classical, philosophic, legal, and political concept from the long 2,000 years history of Indic thinking. But that doesn't mean it takes any of the post-Abrahamic concepts either. What is as rich, if not more rich, a history than the Brahmanistic Hinduism of India is, of course, the long, extremely capacious history of the idea of justice in Islamic traditions. So the main point that I had made in the preamble is that about sovereignty. So sovereignty in the people versus sovereignty arising from Allah. So here we already see one departure from Islamic jurisprudence. But other than that, what do we get? Now I think I'm going to shock you a little bit, maybe, or maybe you know this and it just doesn't get out in the literature. There's far more overlap between Islamic jurisprudence in our preamble than there is between Brahminical jurisprudence in our preamble. Now, why is that the case? Because of the intercourse, the discourse, the correlations between the evolution of the concept of justice in the so-called West and Islamic, classical Islamic philosophy. So the Islamic philosophers who had incorporated ideas from the ancient world, like translating Plato and Aristotle, preserving those manuscripts in Baghdad or whatever the regions were when Europe went dark, and then through the Moorish invasion of Spain, bringing those across northern Africa back into Spain, so that Moorish Spain then had all of the copies of the ancient Greek writings, including Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, that then, this is around the 12th century, that then bled into northern Italy and Flanders in order to produce what? The Renaissance. The European Renaissance is a gift from Islam, the transmission of this literature. And that Renaissance then produces the likes of Machiavelli, Hobbes, and ultimately the Enlightenment like Kant and Hegel, which is the summary exposition of precisely the concepts that are put into our preamble. So very interestingly, and totally unrecognized, is that the preambular conceptions of justice, despite the rejection of the notion of sovereignty from Islam, the preambular conceptions of justice in the Indian constitution have a greater provenance related to the Islamic concept of justice than it does to the dharmic conception of justice. I think you must be realizing that very few people articulate this point, but it's an extremely important point. Now let's see how does it get there? Where does it arise from? Third phase of this talk, and I won't go on. There will only be 5 phases, so if you're getting tired already, just 2 more to go. When we look at what we call modern India, so the 1870s up to 1950, we get the dynamic exchange of concepts and ideas in addition to political and social practices that arise from key figures like Tilak, like Gandhi, like Nehru, Ambedkar, Sardar Patel, Tagore, Maulana Azad, and then, unfortunately, also people like Savarkar and Golwalkar. So these are the constellation of and range of ideas that are going into the Constituent Assembly debates. So when Dr. Ambedkar pulls out of his pocket, this is the preamble that I had in mind, it was genius of him to give only 72 hours for that full constellation of rival ideas to come and attack. So imagine if Dr. Ambedkar had presented his preamble day 1. You have 42 days to rip this thing to shreds. And we would not have had our preamble, we would have had B.N. Rao's preamble, that bland thing that means nothing. We, the people of India, in order for the common good, do this, good night. That would have been it. Why? Because Tilak, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, Sardar Patel, Tagore, Maulana Azad, Savarkar, all of these people are very powerfully, robustly engaged in non-violent and violent debates on the meaning of justice, the significance of justice, and what a Swaraj constitution, the free India's constitution, what conception it should articulate. So, what kind of ideas dominated that debate? We had talked about social, economic, and political justice, the divisions of how justice is articulated in the preamble. Social justice I had characterized as being linked with the notion of equality and characterized by Dr. Ambedkar's primary concern in constitution writing about caste. Then we have the economic justice, which is a way of accommodating, and you can see this in Article 39 of the Constitution, even though constitutional history shows a great deal of, as Anand Teltumde writes about very poignantly, shows a great deal of ambivalence about how much of socialist ideas were getting into our Constitution. Ultimately, private property ruling out over the nationalization of property. But economic justice bringing in these left ideas, and then political justice bringing in basically what we call the Western ideas from Hobbes to Hegel and Marx. But these so-called Western ideas, you need to keep in mind that their own provenance dates back to that transmission of a lot of Islamic ideas that went from places like Baghdad to Spain, to northern Italy, and to the lowlands for the Renaissance. So, in other words, the notion of political justice in the Constitution is a Western notion, but on another occasion, we could delve into what is the history of those Western notions to see that they in fact have very diverse, including Islamic heritage. Let's start in somebody like Hobbes. No, better yet, since Akbar mentioned Plato, let's start with Plato. The Platonic conception of justice I had already articulated as an essentially Aryan conception of justice. What does that mean? One characterized by inequality. Anybody who's read Plato's Republic knows that the nature of justice is to treat people unequally. Does Aristotle improve upon this? Aristotle articulates in his Ethics and Politics what is essentially characterized as a master morality. So while it unfolds within the context of a glorious Athenian democracy, how many people could participate in that democracy? It was a democracy with slaves, women treated as slaves, and where a maximum estimated 9% of propertied men were the ones who got to engage in democracy. Now, do you realize that there were no fewer than 30 movements in the Constituent Assembly to have India be precisely like that? Male propertied are the ones who participate in the Swaraj India. So while it's an old idea, inequality is an old idea, and instantiating inequality institutionally, constitutionally, is a constant threat. It's not something that, the classical notion that we find represented in somebody like Francis Fukuyama, if you may know, that we've been moving from injustice to justice in history, from inequality to equality, from feudalism to parliamentary democracy, that represents in some way the end of all clashes between rival ideologies for the best way of life. Far from it, 1946, 47, 48, people were arguing, let's have a democracy just like Athens, one where only propertied men would participate. Not universal suffrage, not the radical equality that our Constitution ultimately embraced. So one further move that happens with the concept of justice between Plato and Aristotle, which is a positive development, is the idea of reciprocity gets very ingrained. So the Aristotelian conception of justice is one of reciprocity, as opposed to the Platonic conception, which is top-down. So the person, the philosopher king, metes out justice in some respect, and everybody goes in their place. And as long as everybody's in their place doing the thing they're supposed to do, then there's harmony in society, and that harmony on the political side is justice in the city, and on the internal side, I know my place and I fill it virtuously, is harmony in the soul, and that's the conception of justice in Plato. Now, many of you might want to argue with me about this, but just know that I'm right. So, okay, I'm just seeing if you're awake or not. So the reciprocal notion of justice in Aristotle then gets taken into the Latin world, right? The place where we get this word justice, justitia, in Latin. And what that means is that this vague idea that arises merely from morality and ethics becomes concretized in law. And our legal conception of justice has hardly changed from Roman times. Now, one of the major factors that we take is equality before the law. Equality before the law. This is justice in Rome. Now, does that mean that they treated people equally? Not at all. Equality before the law between equals. Equality for equals. So you have equality for equals over and against a conception of inequality for unequals, which means that justice is to treat people differently according to their status. Is that what our preamble says? Quite the opposite. So we have a revolutionary change in our preamble, both from the Platonic and the Aristotelian and the Roman conceptions, because ours is equality of opportunity and irrespective of status. Where does that come from? The change that occurs has to do partly with political developments that are married always to theological developments. So there is one place where everybody is equal, irrespective of status. Where is that? It's not the state. In the state, there are slaves, there are women treated basically as slaves. In the Indian state, there are various kinds of shudras and outcasts. Where is it that everybody is equal? In the mosque. In the mosque. In the mosque. In the mosque. It's a theological conception. A theological conception that radically impacted the political one, that radically interfaced. If you have, on the one hand, a polity that is based on the notion of equality, but then you have a theology that gives content to what that equality is, and these are antagonistic, you're going to get a dialectic that soon enough realizes that the contradiction cannot be sustained. You walk out of a mosque that is supposed to be a locus of equality before God, and you walk into a state which you created, right? Because the state is created by man, and in that state which you created, you succumb to a position of inequality, voluntary inequality. This is totally irrational. And the person who articulates this irrationality, jumping forward with the influence of theology, because Kant is very specific about the influence of theology on his political thought, is in Kant. Kant's conception of justice, which harmonizes the theological and the status, the theological and the political. So on the one hand, we have treating equals equal. On the other hand, we have a state that ranks people in terms of their various what are called dignities. There are various titles or ranks, hierarchies. On the other hand, we all worship, both in Islam and in Christianity, Protestant Lutheran Christianity, with a conception of equality before God. And yet, while God is the sovereign of the theological world, who is the sovereign of the political world? In Kant's terms, man. Man is sovereign in the political world. So how is it that we would take a cosmic order of equality and translate it into a secular order of inequality? So Kant's argument is we need to correct this contradiction. And correcting contradictions, as any of you who study moral philosophy know, is Kant's obsession, right? Because what does it mean to do something morally wrong in Kant's way of thinking? To contradict yourself, right? When you cannot declare your action as a maxim. So if you can't declare your action as a maxim, or the maxim violates the thing that you're doing, this is the contradiction. Contradiction is the fundamental principle of the way that Kant harmonizes his moral and political philosophy, and equality is the way that he harmonizes his moral, political, and his legal philosophy. And justice then turns out to be the harmony, non-contradiction of these various aspects of the human person. The human person, which consists of a dignity that's fundamentally inviolable, that gets regulated in the political state in a domain where that dignity must remain unviolated. So we all know that in terms of I have dignity in the Christian conception, I have dignity inherently because I'm created in God's image. So this is my inherent dignity. But politically, do I have dignity? So the state then has to be created according to the principle of the preservation of my fundamental dignity. And so Kant articulates this manuscript, which is known as Perpetual Peace. I don't know if you've read it, a political, non-critical work, which is used as a foundation for the construction or creation of the League of Nations. So any of you who study institutional history would be familiar with the League of Nations, its failure in the First World War, and then the attempt to recuperate these basic principles of a peaceful global order in the 1940s after the Second World War through things like the UN Charter in 1945, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Now, why am I mentioning these institutions? Because in 1948 and 49, where do you think the concepts of dignity and justice are coming from in this drafting committee? They're coming from precisely these things, from the new German constitution that's being written in reaction, with its first article being a Kantian one. If you know the Constitution of the Republic of Germany, Article 1 is human dignity is inviolable and it is the duty of the state to preserve and maintain it. So these notions from the Kantian conception of justice are getting articulated in constitutions and international charters that our Constituent Assembly drafting committee is reading and incorporating into the preamble. Okay, so we're getting this conception of political justice that's mentioned, articulated in the preamble, through this history, through this legacy from the history of Western, so-called Western philosophy, as it gets realized in practice in institutions like the UN Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights. The concepts that are mentioned in our preamble are the same concepts that go one by one down the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Very different from the Dharmashastras. Okay? So let's leave it at that, but there's something else going on. When you get Kant's articulation, you get a counter-reaction, and that occurs in Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel's thinking, where Hegel starts to criticize and undermine, although he adopts a great deal from it, Kant's notion primarily of two aspects. One is the contract that goes into it, so the Hobbes to Kant contractarian tradition. We had mentioned that society is created by man, and I use this gender because this is how they thought at that time, that society is created by man through contract, through agreements. And what justice means in Hobbes is to keep those agreements. Justice in Hobbes is nothing but keeping your contract. But the notion of the contract suggests a kind of individual. What sort of individual? Do 3-year-olds sign contracts? 5-year-olds sign contracts? The notion of the contract as the foundation of the state through all of these contractarian theories from Hobbes to Kant that get into the UN Convention on Human Rights and Indian Constitution are founded on a notion of an autonomous individual, basically a male, autonomous male, rational individual. Let's forget the patriarchy part for a minute, but you get the idea that in order to sign a contract, contracts in India today are only legally binding if you are major, 18 or older. So in order to sign a contract, who signed the state of nature contract? And how did that person who signed the contract to get out of the state of nature into civil society, how did that person become educated? How did that person become rational? How did that person learn how to sign his name? So Hegel argues, in the philosophy of right, that this is all a fiction. Kant's moral philosophy is predicated upon an autonomy that doesn't happen, that isn't a reality until an individual is born and raised to a level of rational capability. And where does that happen? In the family. So there's a priority of, as we say, the community over the individual that gets articulated as a response or a reaction to the priority of the rational, autonomous individual that's articulated in social contract theories from their beginning up to their incorporation in our Constitution. So that critique then suggests one thing. You can't have an individual without a nation. The reverse of what Ambedkar had argued. You can't have a nation without an individual. Now let's not talk about the Western conceptions, and instead, and this is part 5, so we're coming to the end, and instead talking about modern Indian ideas. Tilak, Gandhi, Aurobindo, Tagore, Ambedkar. What conception did they have? Did they share this conception from Kant, from Hobbes to Kant to Hegel, and I left out Marx. We'll do that on another day. Is this the conception that they shared? What was their notion of justice? Let's just take Gandhi because the time is short. Think about in 1909 what he writes about justice in Hind Swaraj. So in Plato, justice was mimicked in the city and in the soul, the self. Okay, that's called sealto in Greek. It becomes sui in Latin. And it's also something in Sanskrit, sva. So the Platonic conception of the self, where justice is, replicated in the city, is identical in just that framework to what Gandhi articulates in Hind Swaraj, that the sva is a dialectic between the self and the community, the polity, the nation. So he articulates self-rule as this double principle of rule of the self, the sva, and the raj of the sva, and the raj in terms of the Swaraj constitution, the polity. In Gandhi, are mimicking this Platonic notion, twofold depiction, Swaraj is justice. When Gandhi articulates a notion of justice, which he does, if you read those 100 volumes of Gandhi, he mentions it about, and every time that the main time that he does so, he talks more about injustice than justice. Main times that he talks about justice, he articulates it in terms of Swaraj, which means what? You're probably familiar with Hind Swaraj. If you're not, I'll tell you somebody who was very intimately familiar with Hind Swaraj, because the 1919 edition, published in English in India, just in time for someone to read in jail. Who was reading it in jail? 21, 22, published in 1923. Hindutva, Savarkar. So Savarkar gets the 1919 translation, English translation of Hind Swaraj, and then a few years later, Hindutva is produced. Now, any Gandhian will say that it's a heresy for me to link Hind Swaraj and Hindutva. But there are two things that they both share. They share the conception of the nation prior to the individual. The nation prior to the individual. What happens to the sva in Gandhi is that sva is a transcendental self which can succeed in fulfilling itself irrespective of the political regime. So, as if any of you like Shakespeare, Hamlet said, I can close myself in a nutshell and regard myself as a king of infinite space. And the transcendental idea, indeed, which Gandhi articulated in prison is, what are these walls of my jail? My soul flies free. All right, so the notion of the nation prior to the individual gets articulated as the sense of justice in a long history of modern Indian thinking from Tilak to Gandhi to Savarkar, and gets articulated most radically in Golwalkar. In Golwalkar's book, We, you get an idea. It's called We, Our Nationhood Defined. So what is the nation? And what is this book about? In the preface, Golwalkar says the book is about justice. So you see what I'm trying to amplify for you? That on the one hand, we have this conception of justice, which is Ambedkarite largely, that prioritizes the dignity of the individual and consists in ensuring that justice for the individual at the social, at the economic, and at the political plane. And on the other hand, we have the largest community of founding fathers or framers or people whose ideas were attempted to be written into our Constitution, prioritizing the nature of the nation and articulating that nation in terms of specificities that in very precise ways violate our shared sense of the dignity of the individual. And how is that so? I'll just end by articulating the notion of justice along this trajectory, along the trajectory of modern Indian political thinkers who found that justice was not an issue of individual liberty, equality, and fraternity, but was an issue of the unity and integrity of the nation prior to the individual. So in a long history of thought about what the nation is, that goes back many centuries, it has always concluded a few key concepts: ethnicity, territory, religion, language. We can just take these as the fundamental. So territory, religion, ethnicity, language. One is history or culture. In each of these things, you get a narration of who constitutes the nation. So Golwalkar is defining our nation. Justice is the just nation. And what is the nation? The nation is one language. Which one does it happen to be? Well, they tried for Sanskrit. Sanskrit lost, so they went for Hindi. One religion. Which one does it happen to be? Hinduism. And one territory. What does that happen to be called? Hindustan. Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. This is the concept of justice as articulated in Golwalkar, but it's not a rabid right-wing conspiracy. I mean, he may have been the greatest guru of the RSS, but this very notion that the nation comes before the individual, which our preamble rejected, against a great, if you look in the Constituent Assembly debates, you'll see that Dr. Ambedkar had to defend priority of the individual over unity of the nation on 3 different occasions, and on one occasion, someone switched them in blue pen, and then thinking they might let it pass with that switch. That's I can give you the reference of that. I found it very recently. I have to check if it's historically correct. So this notion of the justice being the result or consequence of national belonging harkens back. It's not a radical conception. It harkens back to the Platonic conception of justice, and it goes back to the Hegelian conception of justice. In Hegel's critique of the liberal autonomous individual, because how did that liberal individual, whose dignity is to be preserved, get the way that he or she is? He or she got that way thanks to the nation, thanks to the community. So consequently, the conception of justice, even today, in declaring JNU students anti-national and so on, this harkens back to a specific problem that was only temporarily resolved in the Constituent Assembly when Dr. Ambedkar insisted on putting individual prior to nation. And even though our preamble incorporates various classical Indian ideas, it incorporates them in a way that many of those who prioritize the nation over the individual cannot stomach, because they want the principles of our preamble to have their provenance in the Dharma Shastras, but instead they have a greater provenance in the history of egalitarian Islamic jurisprudence. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, maybe more in question and answer. Thank you very much.